Our next speaker is Kym Anderson, George Gollan Professor of Economics, the University of Adelaide, Australia, who will speak about food price spikes and financial crises, dealing with regional and international market shocks.
Thank you. We did focus just on food price spikes, the volatility of prices, and as with yesterday's vote, we agreed that this was an important problem, especially for the poor. But it was emphasised at the beginning that the poor, even though the majority might be net buyers of food, there's a large minority of poor who are net sellers of food who are vulnerable to spikes downwards in prices. We then thought that the first priority should be to reduce the cause of these fluctuations in prices. And let me just mention 3 or 4 points that were made there. The first was that price volatility could be reduced if we could lower trade costs. They could be lowered at the local level with investments in things like transport infrastructure and price information, as we've seen here in Ethiopia with the commodity exchange providing that sort of information. At the national level, by reducing trade restrictions, not only tariffs on imports, but also restrictions sometimes on exports. At the regional level, with regional trade agreements, but so often they exclude agriculture or diminish agriculture, so that would need to be included. And finally, at the global level, through the WTO, and multilateral agreements to liberalise, of course, are the easiest to implement because everybody does it simultaneously, but unfortunately they're probably the hardest things to agree on, as we've seen with the Doha round. But that greater openness in general, whether it be local or global, thickens markets and therefore makes them less fluctuating in terms of their prices. Secondly, price volatility can be reduced by countries desisting from insulating their markets from international price fluctuations. They, of course, tend to do that because it's good for themselves, but of course it's a beggar thy neighbour approach, and third countries that are trying to remain open are then subject to even larger fluctuations. So agreements at the WTO to desist would be one option there, again very difficult to actually achieve. Thirdly, the new biofuel mandates and subsidies may have been adding to volatility as well as raising the average level of food prices, so fine-tuning of those to make them to ensure they have less impact on food price volatility as an area for action. Fourthly, regional grain reserves were discussed, and we had the very interesting example of the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve Program, which has just come into play. It's hoped that that will lead to less panic buying and therefore less price spikes of the sort we saw for rice in 2008. But this scheme has yet to be tested. We don't know to what extent it will crowd out private stock holding, for example, or how well the triggers will actually work in practice, and how would you have a dispute settlement process in such an agreement if a country withheld exports when prices rose. And then finally, dealing with consequences at the national level, we saw options in place of using trade restrictions that were domestic measures, potentially more efficient measures. They include just making financial markets work better, so people can use that in times when prices are bad for them. Insurance, futures markets as well, and of course conditional cash transfers or the other types of social protection measures that are becoming increasingly more feasible in so many developing countries these days. Thank you.